Hello everyone, welcome again. In this software testing tutorial, we are going to learn about what is database testing. Now, before we get into the details of database testing, I would like to explain a little bit with the example what exactly is a database in the real scenario if you're completely new to software testing or the concepts about the front end, back end, database, etc. So I'll give a brief example of the database, what exactly it means, and when we say database testing, what it stands for. So same example I'll take. So nowadays you would have used many social media website, e-commerce website, right? So there is a front end that you usually coordinate with. So you open the browser, and on the browser you type in, say for example, facebook.com, or if you are trying to buy any items, you go to amazon.com or flipkart.com and you open those websites in a browser. So that is what the front end is. So when you can see the website in a browser, you can browse the product, you can add the product, you can do the purchase. So anything that you see on the front end, or you can access on in the browser, or it is available to you as a mobile app, is a front end, because you can directly interact with that particular instance, right? So in an e-commerce website, say for example, there is login functionality or registration functionality that we have been taking throughout this particular series. So when you click on a register link and you have certain details to provide, so for example, first name, last name, right, your email address, your password. So there are a couple of details that you need to provide in order to register yourself on a particular website. So e-commerce website, before you can order, there are you can order as a guest as well, but then still you have to provide the details of your shipping address, etc. Now once you provide your registration information or any temporary information on the website, you click on a register button or submit button, whatever button is there on the front end. What happens to the data that you have entered here? So what happens to the first name, last name, email, etc.? Where does that particular data goes to? You just get a message that your registration has been successful. How do you get that message? So that's where this front and back end thing comes in picture, and I'll try to keep it very simple. I won't go into many technical details. So this instance here which you are accessing on the browser is the front end. Now once you submit all this data goes into the database, right? So there are lots of databases available, and I'll cover the complete database tutorial in a separate series because it's a vast topic, but for now I'm just covering the basic of database testing so that you know what exactly database testing is. So once you submit this, there is a database where all this information is stored in the form of tables. So there are tables, and there is it's a complex piece of software and which is installed on a server, and that's where all this information that you provide in the registration form gets stored, right? And this information is stored and persisted there. So your first name, last name, until unless you update it, it gets stored there. And once you are registered, you log in. If you want to update your details, you can go to my profile, and in your profile it will again show you your name, first name, last name, etc. So where does it fetch that information from? It basically fetches from the database where it has stored. So in the registration page, you provided the detail and that information gets saved into the database. Once you go to the my profile after logging in, say for example you want to change something on the my profile page, the same information is being pulled from the database and displayed on the my profile page. So you will get first name, last name there, and other details. If you want to update there, you can fetch the detail and you can click on update button and update the detail, right? So this is a brief introduction about the database and what happens when you interact with the front end and how the data is stored into the database. So when we talk about the database testing, so we have talked a lot about the functional testing of the front end, right? Now in the database testing, what we are focused completely on is how the database design, schema, everything is working as expected or not, because within the database for an e-commerce website there will be lots and lots of stored procedures written, so which is basically a short program similar to what you see on the front end or any other programming languages. So there will be a lot of work that needs to go ahead and being done within the database as well. So there will be stored procedures, there will be business logic that can be written within the database to basically ensure that data, when data is stored, if there are any triggers that need to be triggered, so all that thing that needs to happen is also programmed within the database. Okay, and it's in the form of SQL, so structured query language, so which we'll cover in detail in the database testing tutorial. Now as part of the database testing, when you are focusing on completely testing how the database looks like, what all business logic has been implemented, what all triggers are there, so there are some key things that you test in database testing, and those key things are basically the database schema, right? So when you test database schema, you test tables, rows, columns, relationship between tables, right? So how the tables are structured, how the schema is designed. So for the e-commerce website, when we say schema, how tables are structured, how they are related with each other. So all that information or all that architecture needs to be verified as part of the database testing. Apart from that, data integrity, right? So data integrity is another thing. So when the data is stored, when you retrieve the data, so data integrity is another part of it. Consistency of data, right? So how consistent is the data, so data consistency. Then you have triggers. So these are some of the things. Stored procedures, right? So these are some of the things that you basically are interested in verifying when you are doing the database testing. So just doing the functional testing from the front end doesn't ensure that the database has been tested and everything that has been implemented into database has been tested correctly. So there are many things that you test within the database. So these are some of it. Now, what are some of the key things, or basically key activities that you need to check when you are doing database testing? So ideally there are 4 points that you need to remember. The first one is basically your data mapping, right? So data mapping is the first thing. The second one is your ACID properties. So ACID properties verification, and I'll cover what ACID properties are and what exactly it means by ACID. So atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability. So I'll explain this with an example, right? So the third important thing in the database testing is data integrity, right? So integrity, I'll explain about data integrity as well. And the fourth thing is the business rules. So business rules. So business rules are also implemented within database. So when you are testing the database, you need to ensure that the business rules that are implemented within database are working as expected, similar to what we have discussed for the functional testing of the web interface, right? So now when we talk about the data mapping, right? So data mapping, as I have taken the example, so you have the front end, okay, and at the front end you register, you have the registration functionality, you provide the data in the registration page, you submit the form, and then the data is stored into the database, right? So there will be some tables within which this information gets stored. So within the database there will be tables with rows and columns. That's how the relational database store the data, and when this information is stored within this particular data, what you need to verify is that the first name that you have provided here gets stored correctly into the first name column, or the cell, the cell value that has been defined for the first name. Similarly, for the last name, it is getting stored correctly. If there are any other attributes like email and etc., they are getting stored correctly. So that's what data mapping testing is. You verify that the data that you are providing on the front end gets stored correctly into the back end, into the database, and is mapped correctly. Okay. The second important thing, I'll come to the ACID properties verification later. This is a bit bigger topic. So let's come to the data integrity first, right? So in the data integrity, what you do is you verify the CRUD operations. So create, read, update, and delete. So these are the key operations that you need to verify when you are talking about the data integrity. So in the create, what we have done here is when we registered, we created the data and we verified the data mapping into the database. Now when we want to also ensure that the data that we have stored into the database, we can read that data. So how we can read the data? So you'll write the SQL queries and you will fetch the data that you have stored. So usually in the database testing, you will mostly be writing the SQL queries and performing the operations. There will be some scenarios where you might be involving the UI part of it. So for example, in the My Profile, you would be fetching the data, which is basically the read operation of the existing data. Then update is another operation. So in the My Profile, if I open the UI and try to update my first name and last name and store it, that's what the database or the CRUD update operation of the CRUD is. So in the update, whether the first name, if I have updated my first name or my email address, whether that get updated and stored correctly and is stored correctly within the database, and the previous email that I have saved has been overwritten with that. So these are some of the operations that you will do. And then delete, if I delete my account data, whether that data gets deleted from the table or not, right? So this is about the data integrity. So you verify the data integrity. When you perform the CRUD operations, the operations are getting performed successfully and you are getting the expected data as expected, right? Then comes the business rules. Now in the business rules, what happens is usually in the database you will have the stored procedures and there will be business rules written as well. So there will be short programs written within the database which will get triggered based on certain automatic triggers. For example, there is an e-commerce website, and on e-commerce website there is a pricing validation that needs to be done, or discount validation that needs to be done. So those rules can be implemented within the database. So if, say for example, somebody enters the discount percentage as negative or input as negative, then in that particular case the error will pop up or that business rule will fail. So those sort of examples. So this is just the hypothetical example that I am taking, but business logic can be implemented within database, and when we test the business rule or business logic, that's another important aspect of the database testing. All right, so these are the three important things. So data mapping, data integrity, and business rule. Now when we go to the ACID property, which is basically atomicity, and then consistency, isolation, and durability, right? So let me explain these in detail because these property verification are very important as part of the database testing. And so I'll say atomicity. So now coming to the first point, atomicity. So I'll take an example of the bank account transaction. So usually, say for example, you are transferring the amount from account A to account B, from one account to another. What atomicity means is that when you transfer the amount from account A to account B, then the overall transaction is considered as one. What this means is that if the amount is debited from account A, it should be, I'll make a low arrow, if it is debited from account A, it should then at the same time basically credited in account B, and if both of these operations are performed successfully, only then the transaction will be considered as successful, right? And you can imagine why this atomicity is important, because say for example the account is debited correctly from account A but it hasn't been credited to account B, and there will be a big mess into the transaction or banking transaction, right? So that is why this is very important aspect, atomicity, to be verified in the database testing. So all the transactions need to be considered as one as part of the atomicity when we do the transactions from one account to another. So that's one of the example. Now when we talk about the consistency verification, so you are transferring the amount, so you are transferring the amount from A to B. The consistency, what it means is that if you are transferring the amount of $100 from A to B, then $100 should be credited here and should be debited here. So basically the sum after and before the transaction of both the accounts should be same, right? So that's what consistency is. So before the transaction, the sum of both the accounts will be same. Now after the transaction, $100 will be debited from here, but they will be credited from to the B account, right? So still the sum should be same, and that's what consistency property is of the ACID properties verification, right? So consistency. Now coming back to the isolation, as the name suggests itself, when there are multiple transactions happening, the isolation property, what it ensures is that the multiple transactions do not interfere with each other. So if there are multiple transactions happening, then in that particular case they will be serialized in the order which they are triggered, and they are processed in that particular order. So that's what isolation property is. The multiple transactions do not interfere with each other. All right. When it comes to durability, similar examples. For example, we are transferring the amount from A to B. The durability property, what it ensures is that the data is persisted. So when the transaction has been completed, the data is saved properly into the database. So when the transaction happens of $100 from one account to another, then this data or the debit data, whatever the total is, persisted properly here, and in the another account there is plus $100 credited and persisted properly in the other account. So that's what durability property is. So these are very important concept of the database testing and the other properties. So these are 4 key properties. So this is one of it. So ACID property validation, and then along with data mapping, data integrity, and business rule confirmation. So these are some of the key things that you will be performing as part of the database testing. Now this tutorial is very basic of the database testing. This is just a beginning of database testing. I'll be covering the actual practical database testing along with the SQL tutorial that I'll be starting very soon. But for the manual testing and for the interview purpose, this tutorial is very good enough for you to basically prepare and explain somebody to the interviewer what exactly the database testing is, what are the key things that you need to perform. Always go with an example, as I have explained, front end, back end, how the data gets stored, how it is fetched. So just go with the example, remember about the CRUD operations that you will mostly perform, and the atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability, right? So data mapping ACID property validation, data integrity, and business rule confirmation. Just remember these things and you will be perfectly fine with database interview questions. All right, so that's all for this particular tutorial about what is database testing. Hope it was helpful. Thank you very much for watching.